Democratic leader is recognized.
And, once again, not a single witness in the House record that they compiled and developed under their procedures that we've discussed and will continue to discuss provided any first-hand evidence that the president ever linked the presidential meeting to any investigations. Anyone who spoke with the president said that the president made clear that there was no linkage between security assistance and investigations.
No, that's not correct, right? Because, of course, Mick Mulvaney said that the money was linked to these investigations. He said, in acknowledging a quid pro quo, they do it all the time, and we should just get over it. Gordon Sondland also said, the president said, on the one hand, no quid pro quo, but also made it clear that Zelensky had to go to the mic and announce these investigations.
Thank you.
Thank you, Justice.
Mr. Chief Justice, I have a question for the President's Counsel.
To the President's Counsel, would you please respond to the arguments or assertions the House managers just made in response to the previous question?
Mr. Chief Justice, Senators, a couple of points that I'd like to make. Manager Schiff suggested that there was no evidence the President was actually interested in burden sharing because he didn't apparently, according to David Hale, raise it in the telephone conversation that he had with Gordon Sondland that Hale claims to have overheard at a restaurant in Kiev. But let's look at the real evidence. As we explained, on June 24th, there is an email in the record showing it's an email from one person in the Department of Defense to another with a subject line of POTUS follow-up, President of the United States follow-up, asking specifically about burden sharing. It says, quote, what do other NATO members spend to support Ukraine, end quote. That was what they were following up on for the President. And in the transcript itself, the transcript of the July 25th call itself, the President said, we spend a lot of effort and a lot of time. You should really ask them about it. He goes on to say that he talks to Angela Merkel about it, and that they're not really doing as much as raising burden sharing the President's been. Now, some connection between military assistance and investigations into election interference because of statements that Acting Chief of Staff Mulvaney made at a press conference. But that it's been clear in the record since the press conference that what he was saying was garbled and or misunderstood, and he immediately clarified and said on that day, quote, the President never told me any money to the Ukrainians to take end quote. And similarly, he issued a statement just the other day, making clear again that from his counsels was raised in the third person. Nor did Mr. Mulvaney ever have a conversation with the President or anyone else indicating the Ukrainian military aid in exchange for Ukrainian investigation of the recent violence for the 2016 election. That is what the statement. Lastly, onto the point of whether this chamber should hear from and I think it's important to consider what that means, because it's not just a question of just hear one witness. That's not what the real question is going to be. The real question is, what is the precedent that is going to be set, or what is an acceptable way for the House of Representatives to bring an impeachment of the President of the United States to this chamber? It can't be done didn't even subpoena that job. They didn't even try to get his testimony. Now that this body will be will have to do all the discovery, and this institution will be effectively paralyzed for months on end because it has to sit as a court of impeachment. While now discovery is done, that's the rule. And if there are going to be witnesses, then the president would have to, in order to sit fair trial, fair adjudication, then the president would have to have his opportunity to call his witnesses. And there'd be depositions, and this would drag on for months. And then that's the new precedent. Then that's the way all impeachments operate in the future. The House doesn't have to do the work. They do it quick, they throw it over the transom, and this institution gets derailed and has to deal with it. And that should not be the way, that should not be the precedent that is set here for the way this body will have to handle all impeachments in the future, because if it becomes that easy for the House to do it, they'll be doing it a lot. Thank you.
The senator from Massachusetts.
Send a question to
Question from Senator Markey to the House managers. On Monday, President Trump tweeted, "The Democrat-controlled House never even asked John Bolton to testify." End quote. So that the record is accurate, did House impeachment investigators ask Mr. Bolton to testify?
Senators, the answer is yes. Of course, we asked John Bolton to testify in the House, and he refused. We asked his deputy, Dr. Kupperman, to testify, and he refused. Fortunately, we asked their deputy, Dr. Fiona Hill, to testify, and she did. We asked her deputy, Colonel Vindman, to testify, and he did. But we did seek the testimony of John Bolton, as well as Dr. Kupperman, and they refused. When we subpoenaed Dr. Kupperman, he sued us, took us to court. When we raised a subpoena with John Bolton's counsel, the same counsel for Dr. Kupperman, the answer was, Senator, you serve us with a subpoena and we will sue you too. We knew, based on the McGahn litigation, it would take months, if not years, to force John Bolton to come and testify. And I should point out, because I think this is an essential point to underscore, as the president's lawyers say, they didn't try hard enough to get John Bolton. They should have subpoenaed John Bolton. That's what they're telling you. But let me show you what they're telling the court in the McGahn litigation. If we could pull up slide 1. The president's lawyers in court in the McGahn litigation. In the Court of Appeals right now, quote, "The committee," meaning our committee, "lacks Article 3 standing to sue to enforce a congressional subpoena demanding testimony from an individual on matters related to duties as an executive branch official." I mean, it takes your breath away, the duplicity of that argument. They're before you saying they should have tried harder to get these witnesses, they should have subpoenaed, they should have litigated for years, and down the street in the federal courthouse, they're arguing, "Judge, you need to throw them out. They have no standing to sue to force a witness to testify." Are we really prepared to accept that? Now, counsel says, think about the precedent that we would be setting if you allow a House to impeach a president and you permit them to call witnesses. Well, I would submit, think about the precedent you will be setting if you don't allow witnesses in a trial. That, to me, is the much more dangerous precedent here. But I'll tell you there's something even more dangerous, and this was something that we anticipated from the very beginning, which is we understood when we got to this point they could no longer contest the facts that the president withheld military aid from an ally at war to coerce that ally to doing the president's political dirty work. So now they have fallen back on, you you shouldn't hear any further evidence, any further witnesses on this subject. What's more, we're going to use the end-all argument, so what? The president is free to abuse their power. We're going to rely on a constitutional theory, a fringe theory, that even the advocate of which says is outside of the consensus of constitutional law, to say that a president can abuse his power with impunity. Imagine where that leads. The president can abuse his power with impunity. Now, that argument made by Professor Dershowitz is at odds with the Attorney General's own expressed opinion on the subject, with Ken Starr's expressed opinion on the subject, with not only other counsel for the President, Jonathan Turley, who testified in the House, says that theory is constitutional, effectively nonsense, but even 60-year-old Alan Dershowitz doesn't agree with 81-year-old Alan Dershowitz. And for a reason, because where that conclusion leads us is that a president can abuse his power in any kind of way, and there's nothing you can do about it. Now, are we really ready to this president or the next can withhold hundreds of millions of dollars of military aid to an ally at war unless they get help in their re-election? Would we say that you could, as president, withhold disaster relief from a governor unless that governor got his attorney general to investigate the president's political rival? That, to me, is the most dangerous argument of all. It's a danger to have a president who engage in this conduct, trial with no witnesses and set that precedent. But the biggest danger of all, I think, would be to accept the idea that a president can abuse his office in this way, and Congress is powerless to do anything about it. That is certainly not what the founders intended.
Mr. Chief Justice.
Senator from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice. I send a question to the desk on my behalf and also joined by Senators Loeffler, Lee, Kramer, and McSally.
Senators ask of counsel for the president, is the standard for impeachment in the House a lower threshold to meet than the standard for conviction in the Senate? And have the House managers met their evidentiary burden to support a vote of removal?
Mr. Chief Justice, Senators, the standard in the House, of course, the House is not making a final determination in the structure of the Constitution. An impeachment is simply an accusation, and as in most systems where there is simply an accusation being made, the House does not have to adhere to the same standard that is used in the Senate. In most instances, House members have suggested in debates on articles of whether or not to approve articles of impeachment that they should have clear and convincing evidence in the view of the members voting on it that there was some impeachable offense, and that is all. Some not even that standard. And so it is simply enough evidence that an accusation can be made. It is definitely a lower standard than the standard that has to be met here on a trial for an ultimate verdict. The Constitution speaks in terms of a conviction in the Senate. And as both Professor Dershowitz and Judge Starr pointed out in their comments, everywhere in the Constitution that there's any mention of impeachment, it is spoken of in terms of the criminal law. The offenses that define the jurisdiction for the Senate sitting as a court of impeachment are treason, bribery, and high crimes and misdemeanors. The Constitution speaks of a conviction on being convicted in the Senate. It speaks of all crimes being tried by a jury except in cases of impeachment against notions of law. And as we pointed out in our trial memorandum, all of these textual references make it clear that the law should apply in the trial, certainly to the extent of the burden to be carried by the Constitution, which needs proof beyond doubt. And it is very clear that there is not a requirement beyond doubt simply for the House to vote for it. It's a very much higher standard at stake here. As we pointed out in our trial memorandum, the mere accusation made by the House comes here with no presumption of regularity at all in its favor. The Senate sits as trier of both fact and law, reviewing both factual and legal issues de novo, and the House managers are held to a standard of proving proof beyond a reasonable doubt of every element of what would be a cognizable, impeachable offense. Here, they have failed in their burden of proof. They've also failed on the law. They have not stated in the articles of impeachment anything that on its face amounts to an impeachable offense. And on the facts, I think we have demonstrated very clearly that they have not presented facts that would amount to an impeachable offense, even under their own theory. They have presented only part of the facts and left out the key facts. And Mr. Procura, I think, went through very effectively showing that there are some facts that don't change. The transcript of the July 25th call shows the president doing nothing wrong. President Zelensky said he never felt any pressure. His other advisors have said the Ukrainians never felt any pressure. They didn't think there was any quid pro quo. They didn't even know that the military assistance had been held up until the Politico article at the end of August. The only two people with statements on record who spoke to the president, who are Sondland and Senator Ron Johnson, report that the president said to them there was no quid pro quo, and the aid flowed without anything ever being done related to investigation. That is what's in the record. That is what the House managers have to rely on to make their case, and they have failed to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt, failed even to prove it by clear and convincing evidence, failed to prove it at all.
Thank you, counsel. The senator from California is recognized.
Mr. Chief Justice, I send a question to the House managers.
Senator Feinstein asks the House managers. The President's counsel stated that, quote, there is simply no evidence anywhere that President Trump ever linked security systems to any investigations, end quote. Is that true?
Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice, and thank you, Senator, for that question. The President's counsel is not correct. There is, in fact, overwhelming evidence that the President withheld the military aid directly to get a personal political benefit to help his individual political campaign. There's a few points that I'd like to submit for your consideration. First, look no further than the words of the President's acting Chief of Staff, Mick Mulvaney, who on October 17th, 2019, during a national press conference, mentioned, quote, where he was asked about the direct connection between the aid, he said, quote, did he, meaning President Trump, referring to he, quote, also mentioned to me in passing the corruption related to the DNC server? Absolutely, no question about it, but that's it. And that's why we held up the money, end quote. He was repeating the President's own explanation relayed directly to him. Second, Gordon Sondland testified he spoke by phone with President Trump on September 7th. The President denied there was a, quote, quid pro quo, but then outlined the very quid pro quo that he wanted from Ukraine. Then he told President Sondland, quote, that
President Zelensky should, quote, go to the microphone and announce the investigations. He should want to do it. Third, the president's own advisors, including the Vice President and Secretary Pompeo, were also aware of the direct connection. In Warsaw, on September 1st, Ambassador Simon told Vice President Pence that he was concerned the delay in security assistance could become, quote, tied to the issue of investigations. The Vice President simply nodded, tacitly acknowledging the conditionality of the aid. Fourth, we heard from Ambassador Taylor, who in direct emails and texts said it was crazy to tie the security assistance to the investigations. 5, we also know there's no other reason. The entire apparatus and structure of the Defense Department, the State Department, that should have been dealing with the other legitimate reasons. You know, the policy that the President's Council wants you to believe that this was about. They were all kept in the dark. And the supposed interagency process that they made up several months after the fact had ended months before, during the last interagency meetings. And I'll make one final point. Again, if you have any lingering questions about direct evidence, any thoughts about anything we just talked about, anything I just relayed, or that we've talked about the last week, there is a way to shed additional light on it. You can subpoena Ambassador Bolton and ask him that question directly.
Thank you, Mr. Manager.
Mr. Chief Justice,
Senator from Utah.
I send a question to the desk.
Asked of counsel for the President. The House managers have argued aggressively that the President's actions contravene U.S. foreign policy. Sitting in the President's place, certainly more than the place of career civil servants, to conduct foreign policy.
His head and figure it out, then we can impeach him. And the way that they have tried to explain that they can prove that the president had a bad mood is they say, well, we compare what did the president want to do with what the interagency consensus was. And I mentioned this the other day. They say that the president defied and confounded every agency in the executive branch. That's a constitutionally incoherent statement. The president cannot defy the agencies within the executive branch that are subordinate to him. It is only they who can defy the president's determinations of policy. And so what this all boils down to really is it shows that this case is built on a policy difference, and a policy difference where the president is the one who gets to